Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our film as part of the film series on Bergman here at the PFA. Um, many of you have been here before, but maybe some of you haven't, and so I'll tell you that my name is Linda Rugg, and I'm a professor in the Scandinavian department. This is an unusual film series in that we are doing a kind of hybrid presentation. This film screening today is both for the public and for the students who are enrolled in my undergraduate film course on Ingmar Bergman. And so in the audience today, there will be these two groups watching the film together. When the film is over, I will excuse my students from the film course because they're going to discuss the film tomorrow in class. But those of you from the public who are interested, you can stay for a question and answer discussion after the film. We ask you that in the question and answer period, we ask you to wait until you get the microphone in your hand. The reason for that, there are two reasons for that. One is that so that other people can hear what you're saying, obviously, but also we're being taped, we're being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, don't ask for the microphone, okay? And of course, we should all silence our cell phones. All right, so 2 weeks ago, we watched The Seventh Seal, which was one of Bergman's best known films, and it's also his first medieval period film. And I think it's easy for us to understand why Bergman made The Seventh Seal at the time he did during the post-war period in Europe, because this is this story about a knight who returns from an unsuccessful crusade only to find the Black Plague raging in his homeland. And this aligns fairly well with the situation in Europe with the aftermath of the Holocaust and the nuclear terror that was ongoing during the Cold War in the 50s when The Seventh Seal was made. The connection between the Virgin Spring and 1960 is maybe a little harder to discern. I'll try to map it out in a little bit here. But today's film is unusual in the sense that the manuscript for this film was not written by Ingmar Bergman. All the other films, I think, in this series that we're watching had scripts that were written by Ingmar Bergman. This script was written by a Swedish novelist named Ulla Isaksson, and she was a person who had written novels that several scripts were based on, including another one of Bergman's scripts. Some of you may have seen Brink of Life, part of the PFA film series, which came out in 1958. Isaksson, for her part, based her novel on a 13th century folk ballad. So this whole film, the story from the film, is taken from a medieval ballad. When The Virgin Spring was first screened in Sweden, people reacted strongly to the violence depicted in the film. And the reviewer for this, for one of Sweden's major newspapers, wrote, quote, "In its essence, The Virgin Spring contains the most terrible things ever seen on film. It strikes like a fist between your eyes, like a spear through the heart." That's a forbidding introduction to the film you're about to see. And maybe you're having second thoughts about coming. But in fact, the film is simply faithful to the violence of the original medieval text. So why choose a medieval text? Well, one of the focal points of The Virgin Spring is the moment of transition between paganism and Christianity that takes place in the 12th century approximately in Sweden. The Nordic countries were very slow to convert. Rome converts around the year 300. Almost all of continental Europe is Christianized by 600, and then some countries are hanging on to 900. But at that time, the Scandinavian countries were still holding firm in their worship of Odin, Thor, and the rest of the Nordic pantheon. The Icelanders, very famously, converted by parliamentary decision in the year 1000, which is depicted in Jarl's saga, if you're ever interested in finding out how that happened. It's a very funny story. And at that time, churches started to be built and people started to be baptized in Scandinavia more generally. But the official shift to Christianity and the shift that takes place in people's attitudes and people's hearts and people's behaviors and the culture, those two things are different. And it took a lot longer for them to move into Christianity than it did for a parliamentary decision to be made. So in the film today, we see a conflict that's set up between the pregnant pagan servant girl, Ingrid, who is played by Gunnar Lindblom. And Gunnar Lindblom appeared in The Seventh Seal as the silent girl, the mute girl. And so she's on one side, she's the pagan side, and she has a dark wig, and she's sort of dark and dirty, so she's a pagan girl. And then there's this ardent Christianity that's practiced by the rest of the family. And this is emblematized in this blonde, virginal figure of the young daughter who sets off on her horse to celebrate the Feast of the Virgin Mary in a special mass. So along the way, Ingrid encounters Ingrid accompanies her, and Ingrid encounters a true worshiper of the pagan gods, this creepy old man who, like the god Odin, seems to only have one eye. Some of you who know Scandinavian mythology may know that Odin only has one eye, right? Who sits in a high seat that's carved with the figures of the old religion, and this was typical for pagan period homes. And he professes to have the magical powers associated with paganism. On the other side of the equation, we have the mother of the family, who practices mortification of the flesh. That is, she burns herself with hot candle wax to atone for her supposed sins. So there's a question in the film as to how far this supposedly Christian family has moved from paganism when they're confronted with the dilemma. I'm not going to do a spoiler, but the dilemma of whether to take revenge, which of course was the Viking way, taking revenge, or to practice forgiveness. So we'll see how that comes out. The film reproduces many authentic medieval spaces and cultural practices, even more than in The Seventh Seal. Bergman seems intent on reproducing a world of the Middle Ages in the North. The home and the outhouses, a communal supper, the practice of making offerings in church in order to atone for sins, all of those things belong to that age. There's still zippers, however, in the costumes, as you'll notice. The film was shot largely in Dalarna, which is sometimes in English called Dalkarlia. It's a hill and lake country a few hours nowadays by car northwest of Stockholm, near the Swedish-Norwegian border. This was the province where Bergman summered as a child, and it is a region known throughout Sweden for its natural beauty and its rich folkloric traditions. All of this points toward a desire to create some kind of medieval authenticity. But then the question arises, how is this a Bergman film? That is, Bergman is never concerned with a simple reconstruction of the past. His concerns revolve around existential issues, the idea of the divine, and the question is as to whether or not there is a God, and if so, what relationship does God have to human beings? The question of what it means to have a true self, rather than just a performative self. How do we know ourselves? Do we know how we would respond if we are confronted by a life-changing crisis? The question of guilt, of course. The question of what it means to be a mother or a father. And the question of what it means to be married. How do we practice violence on one another? And is there any path for us to escape violence? And so all of these concerns are concerns that Bergman's films generally express. And this one, though it is set in the 13th century, is really not an exception. When this film was released, as I said earlier, there was an intense debate in the Swedish public. In Sweden, censorship is usually directed toward violence, rather than toward normal consensual expression of sexuality or nudity, which concerns them not very much at all. Star Wars, for example, was deemed too violent for children under the age of 15. So it was forbidden for children under the age of 15 when Star Wars was first released. The Swedish censors were criticized for having released The Virgin Spring and complaints were lodged with the justice ombudsperson. Ombudsman is a Swedish word, by the way. But what kind of violence were they talking about? Certainly there are not deaths and carnage on parallel with Star Wars or Bonnie and Clyde or any other number of popular American films, or even any Icelandic saga, for that matter. There's another kind of violence that is, on the other hand, more difficult to handle, in which the film audience is brought into close sympathy and alignment with the victim. So we can address that in the discussion if you like. But the sight of the filmmaking was beautiful. And Bergman himself says of the film, modestly, quote, "The Virgin Spring, that was a good film. I thought it was a hell of a good film. I thought it was one of my best films. I thought it was great." Okay. We'll see. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences also thought it was a hell of a good film. They awarded the Best Foreign Film Oscar to it in 1960. But it was not made with Hollywood in mind. Some viewers may see a resemblance to Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon, which is one of Bergman's favorites. And those of you who have seen Swedish silent film, such as those by Victor Sjöström, we saw him last week, he was the star of Wild Strawberries, may see how Bergman was inspired to work with the Swedish natural landscape. And I should just add as a quick footnote here, that while Bergman was not inspired by Hollywood in making this, Hollywood was inspired by him. Wes Craven's The House at the End of the Street, is that what it's called, was based on the Virgin Spring. That was 1972. Around the time he was making the Virgin Spring, Bergman started to have offers to work with Hollywood. One day, he was filming out in the woods in Dalarna, and he and the crew stopped work to watch two cranes flying high above the fir trees. When the birds had disappeared, Bergman thought, quote, "To have a camera that was not battered, or a camera dolly that would run smoothly, would be great. And it would really be something to have, just for once, more than $250,000 to make a film." Yeah, just for the experience. But despite all that, I say absolutely no to the Americans. Suddenly, I feel relief and happiness. I feel safe and at home. I hope you enjoy the film. We'll talk about it afterwards. Thank you. Okay, as people are clearing the room who need to leave, there were a couple of notes I wanted to make. One thing was, last time we had trouble with the subtitles. This time they were much more legible, and actually they weren't bad, the subtitles. But I would say that, well, there are a couple of things I could say. But a very important thing is that when Ingrid, that is the dark-haired woman who witnesses the murder, the rape and the murder, when she is telling the father what happened, she says, "I saw them attack her, all three of them." Okay, so in her report of it, the boy also participated in the attack, so that's kind of important to know. At the end of the film, Max von Sydow's character, the father, is praying. It's one of these strange prayers that Bergman has, where the person's arguing with God and challenging God. It happens occasionally in Bergman's films. And he says, in the subtitle, he said, "I don't understand." In Swedish, he says, "I don't understand you. I don't understand you, God." So it's much more personified than just the sort of "I don't understand," generally speaking, but I don't understand God. So those are just a couple of notes. For the most part, the subtitles were good. So I'm going to offer the chance for people to ask questions or make comments if you have some, to raise your hands. Some of you may wonder about the sauna, where he goes out and gets the birch branches and then, sort of takes his sauna, this bath. This is part of a cleansing ritual that he's doing before he exacts revenge. And so I think we're supposed to understand it as sort of purification. He also, you remember, he leaves with his sword, he gets his sword out of the chest, and I think the assumption is that he's going to take revenge with his sword, but he uses his sword to cut the birch branches off the tree in order to take the sauna. And then when he's going to kill these people, he says, "Bring me my slaughtering knife." Okay, these are animals. They're not, he doesn't think of them as being peers, and he's not going to dirty his sword by killing them with his sword. That's why he asked for the slaughtering knife. He also puts on a butcher's apron. That's the leather thing that he's wearing. I'm going to butcher these animals. And those are the gestures that he's making. He also waits until the sun has risen, right? He puts the knife on the table, and the knife is going to show him when the sun has risen. It is considered dishonorable to kill people at night, right? And it's not honorable to kill them when they're asleep. So he has to wake them up. Wake up, I'm going to kill you. Because and all of these things that I've just been talking about are part of a Viking code. This is part of the pagan code, is part of the Viking code. So he's following a certain ritual pattern of revenge. And the film has this sort of, as I mentioned in my introduction, this sort of swinging between a pendulum between the Viking code and the Christian code. Okay. So I'm going to give people a chance to talk if anybody has questions or wanted to make any comments about the film. I have a person here, and I have a person up there. So I have a person here and up there. The toad. It's a toad, actually. Importantly. Yeah. Yeah. Flagellating
himself to purify his soul before he. Anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Those are good observations. Okay. First of all, I'm glad you asked about the toad. The toad is a symbol of the devil for Christians, and so the toad is strongly associated with Satan. And when Ingrid sees this toad there, of course we understand, on a pragmatic level that she just wants to play this nasty trick on Karin. She's angry at Karin. So she puts the toad in there, but the toad also symbolizes this sort of devil or satanic or, that toads are often put into witches' brews, that this is in Shakespeare, I think. So that the toad then appears during the murder scene, and the rape scene. So there's a kind of an iconic presence, a satanic presence during the murder scene. And I think that you're quite right to see the way he beats himself with these birch branches. I mean, it is true, if any of you have ever been involved in a Swedish or a Finnish, especially the Finns do this, but the Swedes do it too. Swedish traditional sauna, you're supposed to beat yourself to get the blood circulation going. That's the pragmatic reason for doing it, and to get the dead skin off. And, it's a bathing ritual. But I think you're quite right in seeing that part of what's happening is self-punishment. And why? He was the one who insisted. He insisted that his daughter carry the candles. Initially, the mother said, "Oh, let the servant do it. She wants to sleep in." He's like, "You're too soft on her." Oh, that was one of the translations that was bad. It said she was wet. I don't know if you noticed that. It's like, that's not what he said. I mean, one of the things that's kind of interesting, if you're a language nerd, about this film, is that they try to introduce some old Swedish. Like, they don't always speak modern Swedish. And the word that he uses, blöt, is now used in modern Swedish to mean wet, but in old Swedish it meant mild or soft. Okay, so at the very end, when he holds up his hands in this very dramatic gesture, and it says, "Med dessa mina händer," these my hands. He uses basically an Old Norse form, and it's the film goes back to old medieval language. But anyway, that's a sidebar. It was, I think you're right to see it as analogous to what his wife does with the wax. Yeah, that mortification of the flesh. Yeah. There was somebody up here and someone there, and some people there. Okay. Where's the microphone? Okay, Marshall, go ahead.
I thought at arguably the most intense part of the film, when they discovered the garments, of the murdered daughter, that the pagan code really overwhelmed the Christian code, and it was exemplified by the mother taking the garments, and she seemed to have no hesitation about what was the next thing to do.
Yeah, she bars the door, right, immediately. She sits there. We watch her thought process. I mean, at first, of course, she's devastated. She keeps it together enough not to reveal what she has learned. And then she goes out and cries for a few seconds, and then and then you see her sitting there thinking, and then she gets up and bars the door. So yeah, absolutely, that kicks in, and it extends to telling her husband, and she knows what the outcome. And did you notice the way she doesn't throw the dress at him, but she like puts the dress there. And this is, I mean, if any of you are familiar with the saga literature, there's this thing in the saga literature where women urge men to do their duty. Okay. If you are a man, you will get out there and kill that guy. This happens so many times in the saga. Sometimes you have these men who are kind of reluctant, it's like, I don't know, it's such a big deal. And then the wife is like, if you don't get out there and kill that guy, you are whatever you want to say about that. And the word that's used for that is egging on. Do you guys know egging, to egg someone on, right? And when I was a kid, I thought that meant you like threw eggs at people or something, but it's taken from an Old Norse word that means to put an edge on something. So the edge of a sword is the egg, right? And so egg, means to whet, W-H-E-T, someone's impulse to act, right? And women function as eggers. That's their function. And she definitely does that. So yeah, you're right. The pagan thing, just right away, here you go. If you're a man, get out of bed. She says it's Karin's, it has blood on it. And that's all we need to know. Okay. Yeah. So I have another person here, and go ahead. And there was someone up there too. Okay. Go ahead.
Hello. Okay. The movie to me was almost all pagan. I mean, the praying was,
the tear mouth.
Oh, the praying was the it was like a, how would you say? Well, it was
formulaic. You mean the Christian praying? Yeah, the Christian praying until the end is formulaic, right? Yeah.
And but like when they go into the forest, you were immediately going into the Middle Ages. I mean, pre-Christian.
Pre-Christian time, yeah.
And then the raven in the forest, and the old man. And, but then when the frog, to me, with the worst part of the movie was when the toad jumped out of the bread.
Oh,
I knew all bets were off.
All bets were off when the toad appears.
That was it.
When the toad jumps out, all bets are off. Yeah. I think that what Bergman, or what the story is interested in, I shouldn't say Bergman so much because, as I said, he didn't write this. He didn't write this story. It was Ole Isaksson who wrote it. But what she is interested in is how, under this veneer of Christianity, which is actually, it's a fairly strong surface. That is, there are certain practices that they've put into place. The giving the candles to atone for your sins, the mortification of the flesh, but it has become routine. That's their day-to-day lives. Most of them don't necessarily think about their religious faith so strongly. And underneath these forms, these Christian forms, is this extraordinarily strong current of pagan feeling and pagan thinking that erupts then when a crisis moment comes. And but then, in the end, it returns to the Christian motif, and that's where you have the title, The Virgin Spring, which is a legend. There's this legend. There's a church. It's not in Dalarna. It's in southern Sweden. But there's a church that was built there, and the legend around this church is that this is the church that was built by the man to atone for the sin of having killed an innocent child. It's the child that it centers on. Yeah. So I think that the it's sort of like it shows a conversion to Christianity in a different way at the end of the film. It's still expressed very much in natural form, though. The spring, the water coming out of the ground, this is a natural form that also belongs to the pagan tradition. You notice how that weird Odin guy that I told you about had water running through his house, right? Yeah. So that kind of association with nature was a very strong aspect of pagan practice also. Where did the microphone wander now? There's some up there, people up there.
I'm wondering about the excess in that passion of the father throwing the boy.
Yeah,
that was what the hands, I guess, were so guilty of.
Yeah,
but what about? Are we saying that killing the two murderers was a bad thing to do?
Oh, it was bad too.
Where is where is the police car, or where is the 911 to come and take care of it?
Yeah,
just go away. Right?
It's going to take a long time for 911 to be implemented. Yeah, I mean, and the fact is, I mean, I've actually taught everybody who's a Scandinavianist spends time in the Middle Ages, because that's one of the most important moments in Scandinavian culture. So if you study Scandinavia, you have to study about the Vikings and so on. And one of the things that was very interesting about pagan culture and Viking culture was that they did actually have a very, very intricate legal code, and they had trial and jury. Our trial system is based on the old Germanic trial system. Other countries in Europe have they follow the Roman system that has a judge that makes a decision over everything, whereas our system, the English system, was imported to the United States. The English system was modeled on the Germanic system, which was the same as the Viking system, that had a jury of peers. It wasn't very orderly, but they did have that, and they had lawyers who would argue with each other, and so on and so forth. So what I'm saying about that is that law is not introduced into Scandinavian society with Christianity. It was a very strong function in Christianity in pagan Scandinavia. The legal system shifts a little bit, but the thing that remains problematic about both the pagan and the early Christian legal system is that there's no administrative function. There are no jails. There's no capital punishment. The trial would decide the punishment, and then the people would have to carry it out themselves. It was a case of also catch the criminal if you can kind of deal. So that would have been the legal system that would have been in place. But what becomes interesting here is that the whole question of who deserves to be punished and who does not deserve to be punished, who is innocent and who is guilty. How do we decide that? And also in the Christian system, which I mentioned in my introduction, there's supposed to be a forgiveness function. I mean, that doesn't usually kick in for murderers and rapists, but certainly he's asking for forgiveness for a murder that he committed in an unjust way against this boy. Yeah. Yeah, I have a couple people here, and I have people
here. The three bad brothers, one of whom has no tongue, I suppose that's kind of emblematic, seemed to me to be excessively stupid in that they bring the clothes of their victim to the parents, to that enclave. And I'm wondering if the source material for the story equates stupidity, criminality, paganism, and Christianity with a more advanced mentality.
That's an interesting question. First of all, I don't think that they know that they've done that. I think that they don't realize that they have, even though they act very guilty in the whole eating scene, and the boy especially he can't eat. He's so distraught. But I think that we're supposed to understand that they don't realize that they've come to that farm. Otherwise, he wouldn't have presented the clothing to them, obviously, right? But I do think that the other part of what you're saying is probably accurate, that these goat herds are of lower intelligence, and the reason the person would have their tongue cut out is because he committed some other crime earlier, no doubt, right? I'm sure that he got punished for something, and that's why he was missing a tongue. His brother says it's because, oh, some terrible people cut out his tongue, and it's like, yeah, I'm sure he did something to those terrible people. That's why they cut out his tongue. But I should say that the original medieval ballad is more complex in a way, because in the original medieval ballad, it turns out that the 3 traveling goat herds are the sons of this guy. So the father is both the father to the girl who got murdered and to these wandering guys. Yeah. And in the medieval ballad, there are 3 daughters and these 3 brothers, and it turns out that they're actually their brother and sister, right? And then the knight is like, oh, I've killed my whole family. So the medieval ballad is ever so much more complicated in a way. But Bergman, and Isaacson, I should say, they decide to go with a much more plausible storyline, so that you can see that these guys are a little bit stupid, but I don't think that they know. I don't think they understand where they are. Yeah. I have people down here, and I have people up there.
Hello. Too strong. I have 2 strong images.
Can you raise your hand? I'm sorry, I can't. Over here. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
2 strong images. One is when Karen got her whole garment on. The thing that was most dazzling was the silver belt.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it didn't, I was so surprised when it didn't show up with what they turned, because it seemed
most valuable. Yeah.
Yes, it just had such a striking impact.
Mm-hmm.
And the other is that what seemed like the oldest brother, was the one who seemed to be raping her in the scene that we saw.
Yeah.
And that, and yet his death is the easiest.
Mm-hmm.
And that bothered me.
Oh, you wanted him to suffer. That's your pagan side coming out. Yeah. The pagans in the audience. Yeah, I mean, and also he's actually the only one who, I mean, the speaking brother obviously aids and abets, right? So they're involved to varying degrees in what happens, right? And so the question is this speaks again to this question that I mentioned earlier, like how guilty is everybody? Is everybody guilty of murder? It's the brother who can't speak who hits her with a cudgel also. And so he's the one who actually rapes her, even though he's very much abetted by the middle brother. And he is the one who strikes her. And the boy, the youngest one, is really not involved at all. At first he thinks it's kind of funny, the whole situation, but then it becomes not funny. And he is utterly devastated by what happens. And before we go to the next question, I just have to say one thing about the film, and it's my favorite part, which there's an actor in this film named Alan Edval, who plays the monk who makes that speech to the boy. You're going to walk across a narrow footbridge. There will be dark water trying to get you, but you'll come to the other side. And he goes through 3 different ordeals that the boy is going to face, and then assures him that he's not going to be taken by the evil one. So Alan Edval in this film, Alan Edval is going to play the father in Fanny and Alexander. If you guys have seen Fanny and Alexander, he's the father. He doesn't have large roles in Bergman's movies, but he always has a key role. This role that he has here is very important because he's prophetic. He sees what's going to happen to the boy, and he tells the boy, "You're going to be okay. When you get to the other side of this, God is going to take care of you," right? And in the next film we're going to show, he also has a very important tiny role where he has a key speech. So he often carries the weight of part of the film in a small role. but he's one of my favorite Bergman actors. You won't see him very often, but he's a great actor. Okay, I said my piece. So who else wants to say something? There's one here too. Okay.
Oh, I thank you so much for this. I've seen a lot of Bergman films, and this one seems to me to be the key to his focus in the trilogy and the Silence and Winterlight.
The God
and all
trilogy,
of that.
so-called, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, of the Silence of God, and when I saw it this time, I don't know if I just was in a very vulnerable place, but I felt I felt like I identified with everyone all the way through. I mean, especially with what's going on now in the media and all of this stuff about sexual abuse, and the way that the rape is portrayed gives you. I mean, you're both horrified, and then you're wondering what is going to happen. Is there going to be retribution for this? Because if you're a father, you imagine this happening to your child, how would you ever be able to just say, forgive them, they know not what they do?
Yeah.
I mean,
that's asking too much of a human being, right?
And then of course like what you just said about and also the folk song, the ballad or whatever it is from the Middle Ages
that they sing.
It's a beautiful thing. It's talking about something that's impossibly terrible that has happened.
Yeah.
And it's saying ta-ram-pa-ra-dee-da-dee-da-dee-da. And
that's in a minor key, but yeah. Yeah.
Well,
it is a minor key. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but there's joy in minor keys and there's sadness in major keys.
Yeah.
Schubert said that.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good quote. Yeah,
I don't know if this. I don't know what my question is. But is there any? I mean, How can we come to terms with this where Bergman is capable of I mean, if you read the story and you just read it, it's one thing.
Yeah, that you see this.
But when you see it, it's a completely different thing.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I think that it's obvious that our minds are going to go to what we're thinking about now, as a community, as a larger national community also. And I think that what is so powerful, and you're putting your finger on this, is that and I tried to hint at this before the film began, is the way that violence is depicted. So there's this, this long shot of these people. She's fighting. She's struggling very, very hard. She's completely overwhelmed by these people who are larger than she is and gang up on her. We've heard already earlier how important it is for her to preserve her virginity. That's a value in her culture, and that's something that she treasures, somewhat arrogantly perhaps, but she does. And we also see that she mismeasures her own capability. She goes, well, if somebody did that to me, I would just throw them off. And as a young person, as a young girl, she, of course, believes in herself. She's been brought up to feel that she's a special person, that she's a treasured person. And we see all of that in the scenes before this attack with her parents, where we see that they spoil her. She's their only child. She's the light of their lives. They're kind of jealous of each other about the relationship with her. And this person is treated like a piece of garbage, really. And you have to sit there and watch it. And that is very, very tough, I think. And also when she stands up and she's trying to figure out what to do and she's crying, that goes on and on. It feels like that scene goes on for a half an hour. It's only a couple minutes, right? But in that moment, you're like, okay. And of course she can't survive because she'll go back and tell and witness, right? So I think that the way that he shows violence, the violence against her, the violence against the boy, And also the psychological violence. I mean, someone mentioned already the scene in which the mother is confronted with her dead child. She's been sitting up all night waiting for her child to return. She has been terrified about what could potentially happen to her. And now the clothes get handed over to her, and she sees blood on the clothes. And she knows that something terrible has happened to her daughter. And so that's a form of psychological intensity that is also present in a lot of Bergman's films. Confrontation with the absolute worst thing that could happen to you. That's something that he's interested in. And so that's what we see in the film as well. So it's very powerful. Okay, I have some other people. Yeah, Susan down here. Yeah.
I guess I have the microphone.
Okay, whoever has a microphone gets to talk.
Hi.
Okay, well, I don't know where you are, though. Raise your hand. Up there. Okay,
I love this film, and I love your commentary on it and all the films. It's just been a great series. But I wonder if you might say a little bit about the saga that you mentioned a little earlier about the Icelandic parliament voting in Christianity.
Okay.
You said it was a funny story. Maybe.
I'm sorry. Which story? I'm not sure I understand. Which one?
It was you mentioned that Iceland used a parliamentary.
The conversion story.
Yeah, the conversion.
Okay. I think it's chapter 106, maybe in Jarl Saga, maybe 110. Anyway, in Jarl Saga, there's just this chapter in which they show the Icelanders have gathered at the Althing, which was their yearly parliamentary gathering where they would all collect everybody from all parts of the island and gather, and they would of course trade and tell stories, but they also conducted court cases, and they also made law. Okay, so it was their Congress, and it's the oldest running Congress in the world. 876 was the founding year, I think. I have to check that. But it's in the 9th century, at the end of the 9th century. So at the Althing, there's been a lot of attempts to try to convert the Icelanders, and there's been this Christian missionary that the Norwegian king sent, and people are very divided about how the Icelanders should go, and the missionary has been attacked by people, and he's killed people with his crucifix, and there's all kinds of stuff going on with the missionaries. And the Icelanders realize that the Norwegians have already converted, that the king has converted in Norway. And also most of Europe, continental Europe, is Christian. And they're sort of seeing which way the wind has been blowing. But they say, well, let's decide this scientifically. So they take this guy and they put him in a tent with a thing over his head. He's a prophet. He's a seer. And they say, you sit there and meditate on this, and then you get back to us and tell us what we're going to do. And that's our science. And so the guy meditates on this, and then he goes, okay, I'm going to make my announcement, but everybody in advance has to promise that they're going to abide by it, and this is going to be the law of the land. So will everybody swear? And everybody swears. And then he says, okay, we're all Christian now. That's it. Okay. And then they rode home from the thing, is what it says. So the thing was their court, Tinget. That's the funny story. But I mean, it's funny, but it also is really supposed to be a real thing that happened in Iceland. So if you ever go to Iceland, there's a place near Reykjavik called Thingvellir, which is where the thing used to meet. It's just an open plain because they all camped out there, and that's where that happened. Okay. Yeah.
So I spent 28 years in Minnesota, which is full of Scandinavians, and started watching the Bergman movies in 1970 at McAllister College. And thank you very much for your introductions. These are really helpful. And I was wondering about that comparison also between this movie, which was made in 1960, and the present events about sexual assault, and particularly the first part. Now, in 1960, there was very firmly the idea of a woman is property. But I also know that the Scandinavians have, and the Pagans, of course, had very strong women figures.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering about that part where she has been to the May Festival, or they're talking about
the dancing,
the May Queen, the dancing and things like that. And whether in 1960 or whether in these terms she would be sort of the guilty party, or whether she is really truly seen as an innocent in this. I mean, my viewing of this now is that she was very much an innocent. However, I don't know about what was going on with Bergman in 1960.
Okay, so what is the context? What's the cultural context for sexual violence in 1960, or sexual or gender equality in Scandinavia? The sexual revolution that we had here started somewhat earlier in Scandinavia, and also the sort of argument for gender equality also gets going earlier in Scandinavia. And by 1960, it was not the case that, gender equality had been achieved, or even that maybe gender equality has been achieved even today. But it was certainly the case that what Bergman was interested in was strong women. And this young woman is a strong woman to the degree that she is bent on making her own choices. I danced with this one and this one and this one and this one, but then this guy comes up to her and tries to imply that there was something else going on, and she's like, no, I have nothing to do with you. But that's partially also a class issue, because Ingrid, her servant, was obviously, this same man who was flirting with Karin got Ingrid pregnant, probably, right? So one of the things that's important to think about is how class plays into the whole issue of gender relationships, and how a person of a higher class could imagine that she would have more power. Now, as it turns out, she doesn't have the power that she imagines. And so even in a situation where a woman might express her determination to make her own choices about things, sometimes she's overwhelmed by these forces that still exist in society. So I think that at the time that Bergman made the film, you couldn't really speak about gender equity in Scandinavia, but people were certainly conscious about gender issues, and also about women's sexuality and violence against women. Last time I mentioned we were watching Wild Strawberries, and people sort of asked, "Oh, what's Bergman's attitude towards women here?" There are all these jokes about women, and that's true of Smiles of a Summer Night also. But what you have in these films, so if you look back at Smiles of a Summer Night, you have Desiree, the actress, plans the whole thing and sets up everything according to her desires, and it all works out according to Desiree's plans, right? And then in Wild Strawberries, arguably the daughter-in-law Marianne helps to turn Victor, the Victor Sjöström, Isak Borg, helps to turn him around. Helps to convert his character, and she has this very strong presence in the film. I mean, here we have a woman, a very young woman, who expresses strength and sort of autonomy, but unfortunately she's overcome partially by her naivete, that she doesn't realize that there are people who would wish her ill, because she's a person who's been brought up in a situation where nobody wishes her ill, except maybe Ingrid, putting the toad in the bread. But yeah, I think that's as much of an answer as I probably could give right now. I'm sorry, the May celebration? Well, the May celebration, Midsummer, is a celebration in June where people get very alcoholic and inebriated, and there's a joke in Swedish society that the birth rate goes up 9 months after Midsummer. And in fact, I know 3 people who were born in that week that in my circle of friends, including my husband. And I once made him laugh because he has the same birthday as 2 of his closest friends. And I said, wow, that's crazy. How did you guys all have the same birthday? And they all start laughing. Don't you know, in Midsummer. So sexual freedom was always sort of a key element in Swedish society, but it tended to be more limited to the lower classes at that time. I think I can take one more, and I think I can take one more. Which one you have had? Yeah. Not ours. I have one person here, and I have one person there too. Okay, I'll take two, and then I'll. Did you still want to talk, Susan?
Yeah,
You can talk to me later. So this lady and this gentleman, and that'll be it. Okay. Do we have the microphones? Oh, this guy, you have something. I'm sorry, I can't see. Go ahead.
All right. I saw that there were the mother and the servant girl, Ingrid.
Yeah.
Both of them had felt that they were guilty and they were responsible for what happened to her, to Karin.
Yeah.
And of course, there's some envy and jealousy and all of those themes playing. Is that something that we interpret as some form of Christian sin that they are expressing, and that's what's coming out in here? Because Ingrid
she's pagan,
yeah.
I don't think that it is, and that's an interesting question actually, because in the context of the world view that we're depicting, and in the context of the medieval ballad from which this would originally come, you would say, yes, this is guilt about sin. But I think that Bergman is more interested in a modern sense, Bergman and Isaksson, the writer, in how modern human beings experience guilt. That is, that things happen, and we have this feeling that somebody must be responsible for that thing. It's hard to accept a world in which things just happen chaotically. Right? Someone must be responsible. We have to assign guilt somewhere. And very often we'll assign guilt to ourselves, especially in a situation where someone who's close to us is hurt. So everybody experiences some form of guilt. I think, the people who are close to Karin, the girl who dies, her mother clearly experiences some form of guilt about. And the way the mother expresses the guilt is in very Christian terms, right? I loved her too much. But that has a ring of superstition about it also. I wanted this too much and therefore it didn't happen, right? The other person, Ingrid, really has a strong sense of guilt because she prayed for something bad to happen to her. And she also stood by and didn't do anything. Now, it's very arguable as what she could actually do in this situation. I mean, she goes, I had this rock and I was going to throw it at him. And I'm like, that would work. Not, but the idea that she didn't do anything and she watched, and that at some level she'd hoped that this would happen, that brings about the guilt. And the father, I already addressed the idea that he sent her out. He made her go when really maybe she didn't have to, So they all feel some kind of guilt. And I think Bergman is interested in this sort of widely dispersed form of guilt, that when people are near something catastrophic that happens, they have a tendency to want to place themselves there as guilty for having done that. But I think it's more modern. Yes, it's a theme in many of his movies. Yes, thank you. It is. So that's what makes me think. Yeah. I had this woman in the front here. Did you ever get the microphone? Yeah. And no, I'm sorry. I was looking at a different person, but
this person.
Or did you? Okay. I'm sorry. It's hard to see where people are, so I was pointing back there because she had her hand up. Yeah.
Well, I know he had a lot on his mind, but I was surprised that the father had no reaction to Ingrid's confessions of guilt, some of which, were pretty strong in her hatred or jealousy.
I prayed for her to die. Yeah, I think, well, how did you interpret that? Did you have an interpretation?
No, I really was wondering.
Okay, this is my interpretation. All right. I've thought about that too, obviously. I looked at him because he's devastated. I think that Ingrid is a child in the household. She is okay. So in the old Icelandic family, there would be people who would be brought into the family to live as foster children. Okay, foster people, and the Old Norse. Our word foster actually comes from Old Norse. It means fetus. It means a child in the womb, right? So a foster child is a child you bring up from infancy. It doesn't always happen that way, but you take over that person into your family. Ingrid was a illegitimate child who so she wasn't brought into the family on an equal status with Karin, but nevertheless we have to imagine that she was living in the family as a child of the family. And so what he hears, I think, when he's listening to her is her powerlessness. She thinks she could have done something. She thinks she was somehow responsible, but he knows that she was just jealous of his daughter, which was only normal. Of course, she was jealous of her. Karin was the petted favorite of everyone, who had all the pretty clothes and who didn't have to go milking and who didn't have to do any of the work on the farm and could keep her hands beautiful and all this other stuff. And so of course Ingrid was jealous of her. So I think that he shows a real depth of understanding for her in that scene, where he puts, it's not only his silence, but he puts his hand on her face, and holds her head, So it's this gesture which to me reads, I forgive you, and so in that moment he's able to be forgiving, and he's able to hear her. Through her speech, he's able to know what kind of anguish she's experiencing. Yeah, she was. I think she was there as a child because that's the way she was talked about in the family. Yeah. Okay, I have one more person and then we have to stop. Oh, I had this guy over here who had Oh, they can't hear you. You have to, I'm sorry. You have to bring it to your, I think is it on? I can hear him, but I guess you guys can't. Okay.
Now?
Yeah,
okay.
Now that you're.
Well, during that time, her clothing and to have a horse would be the currency of nobility, and she would be invited into any home and be safe everywhere.
You mean Karin, or do you mean Ingrid? Karin.
Karin. I mean,
Karin,
the daughter.
Yeah, Karin. Yeah, Karin felt that way. Yeah. Because
not only would she, but that's the entitlement that we still live with. Yeah.
To some degree, but then people, and even today, though, people are caught by surprise when they feel they're entitled. Yeah.
And then
sometimes
the other is the guilt. To me, is really important because that's the currency of religion, especially Christianity in the beginning.
Yeah. Okay, so let me just address, sorry, this is annoying. The idea of guilt. Okay, so in Scandinavian languages, it's the same in other Germanic languages. The word for guilt is the same as we use for the word for debt, that you owe someone else something. Skuld or skuld is the idea of actually owing something to someone. And in some renditions of the Lord's Prayer, they use the word debt. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. But what really is meant by that is not our monetary debts, obviously. So, but is meant the things that we owe to each other, the things that we've failed to do, the things that the ways in which we've fallen down in our interactions with each other. So monetary debt and this kind of guilt is expressed with the same language, but guilt is felt in terms of our in a Christian sense, it's oriented towards the ways in which we failed God. We've fallen short of God's expectations. We owe God better behavior. We owe God, this kind of. But in this film where there is sort of a religious presence, guilt also has to do with what we owe each other. It's more communal and oriented towards the ways in which we fail our fellow human beings, I would say. I have to stop here. People are needing to go, and so I thank you for coming. I'll see you next time.